Hey, Watermark, man, great being with you this past Sunday. Man, just my name's Kirby St. I don't know if you were there or not, but get a chance to meet you or greet you. But I'm the district youth director. Kind of what that means is I oversee 250 churches, all of the youth programs. So if your kids have been at camp or youth convention or one of those events, kind of falls under my leadership. But man, one of the things that we were hitting on this morning at church was just what your teenagers are trying to do when it comes to missions and speed the light giving and man, one of the incredible things your kids are trying to do is they're trying to hit $60,000 when it comes to impacting people around the world. One, their physical needs, but two, their spiritual need. And so that's kind of what we were hitting on. We were talking about kind of the direction we were going this morning. Speed the light, kind of what that does is it provides transportation for any missionary that we send out onto any part of the world. It gets them into countries where, man, maybe they cannot go and share the gospel. They can't live as a Christian or as a missionary, but they can go as a Christian. And we start up a business and we get the business going in that community. What we do is we rescue people that are being trafficked, human trafficking, rescue people out of human trafficking. We do a lot of stuff with Convoy of Hope, which is kind of disaster relief, some feeding initiatives, that kind of stuff. We do some water well stuff in different parts of the world where we go into places where there's no water. I was just there last week actually where there's no water, and some places have to walk 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours to get water to bring it back to their village. We go into places like that, and in that spot we put a well right next to a church. And so what we're seeing across all of these avenues is not just meeting a physical need, but man, meeting a spiritual need. And so we try to bring the two together to try to create some just amazing things. When I was in Africa just this last week, what we saw is everywhere that we've planted or that we put a well in next to a church, the 3 villages we were at, all 3 of them in the last 6 to 8 months have doubled or tripled their attendance. People come to Christ. We went to one place, we were actually drilling the well that day. The well wasn't even there. The church is just a few months old. And while we were there, just praying over the pastor, that's all we did. 3 people gave the heart to the Lord because they were so excited because how water was going to meet their physical need. But in the process, it was already beginning to meet their spiritual need. And so, man, it's been so fun to just be a part. You guys are a part. And so, man, I want to challenge you. Man, get behind what the students are doing. They're literally transforming and changing the world. And so, man, one of the things that we were talking about this morning as we kind of get into this thing, we looked at the story of the Good Samaritan. And the beginning part of that is in Luke chapter 10. It just says in verse 25, it says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? And he says this. He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's kind of where we kicked off this morning is, man, how do we love God? What does that look like? How does that fall into things? Man, love God with every part of us, every part of who we are. So my first question to you today is, what does it look like to love God with every part of who you are? Love God with your heart, with your soul, with your mind, with your strength. What does that look like? So my first question, maybe for discussion this morning or this evening, is how do you love God with every part of who you are? What does that look like for you in the space that you're at the point that you're at in your life? And then the second part of that is, how do you love your neighbor? You love your neighbor as yourself. How do we love people the way we love ourselves? And so now why don't we just take a few moments and talk through those questions? Hey, welcome back. I hope you had a great discussion on, man, how do we love God? And I was thinking through the whole idea of loving God. How do we love God with every part of who we are? It's such an intriguing thing to me. It sounds easy, but super difficult, right? To love God with all that you are, with who you are, with every part of you. Because when that comes into play, I start to think about, man, when you love God with everything, when you love God with all of who you are, He's going to start to ask you some things and do some things and challenge you on some areas of your life. It could be, maybe some things that He wants you to give up. It could be, just how you live your life, what you do, how you go about things, and in that process, I think when we go through and we start to evaluate, man, how do I live my life? How do I love God with everything? We have to kind of go back and say, am I going to live out what God asked me to live out? And one of the things He says is, man, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Go everywhere. Tell everybody about who Jesus is. And if I've really experienced Jesus for myself, if I've really experienced Jesus for man, and he's really changed me, man, if I'm going to truly love God with every part of me, I can't go through that and then not share it with somebody else. And so in the process of that, as we go through this, and as we look at this kind of this evening, and what you heard this morning is just kind of the process of trying to wrestle through with, man, what does that look like? And so in the story, as it continues on, he goes, that's great. Jesus says, yeah, you answered correctly. Then he goes, well, who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? And he goes, and Jesus goes in to tell a story of the Good Samaritan, how man, this guy's on the road and he gets beat up and he's messed up and he's torn up, and the robbers came, they stole everything he had, and he's laying on the side half dead. And a priest comes by, and the priest looks at him and walks on the other side of the road. And then a Levite, another religious person, comes and walks by on the other side of the road. And then a Samaritan comes by. And I don't know if you know the whole idea of a Samaritan and the Jews. They did not get along. In fact, a Jew wouldn't even pass through Samaria on his way to another location. It would be like, man, if you were in Stillwater and you're trying to get to Minneapolis, you wouldn't even dare walk through or drive through White Bear Lake. I mean, it's like you wouldn't even dare go around. You wouldn't go through. That's how much you hated those type of people. And so you'd actually drive around the city to get to where you're trying to go. And so they would walk. And so when he's telling the story, like, who's my neighbor? He's getting this spot where he's going, here's who your neighbor is. It's the person that you hate. It's the person that you dislike. It's the person that you don't want to associate with, or maybe you never would associate with. That's part of your neighbor, along with all the people that you love and the people that you hang out with and the people that you. And so he's challenging going. And so the Samaritan walks by, and just the other people walk on the other side of the road. The Samaritan, he sees the need and he's moved by the need. He says, I cannot just see a need and not be moved by it. Man, love God with every part of you. Man, when we see a need, we have to do something. How do we gain influence in someone's life? How do we do that? Man, when we see a need and we meet the need, we've just gained influence with that person. We see something going on, we've just gained influence. When I walked down to when I was just in Africa and I walked into the village, you know what? I gained influence the moment I walked on. Why? Because I was the one that put the well in. Or I was a part of organizing the church, the well you put in. I walked in as in a representation of who you are, and I walked onto this place. And the moment I walked in, I'm loved, I'm accepted. People are wanting to high five me. Why? Because I gained influence because I met one of their needs. And the moment you walk in to meet someone's need, the moment you walk in to do something, and that's when you begin to meet someone. So my question, the second question today is this: man, who's my neighbor? How do I love my neighbor? Who's the person that maybe is in my life that is in need? Maybe it's someone at your work. Maybe it's someone in your family. Maybe it's somebody in your neighborhood. Maybe it's on a sports team or something that you do. Maybe it's friends that you hang out all the time. But how do we take what God has done in our lives and love somebody and impact somebody with our life and let them experience a little bit of who God is through the way that we reach out to them? And so who is your neighbor, and what can I do to reach into their world? All right, hey, man, hope you're figuring a few things out and processing on how you reach people, how you love people. But man, it really is seeing the need. And man, I was actually with Jarvis a few years back, I believe, and we were in Tanzania together. And I remember a story of we went to this church, and the church was in a crazy, extreme Muslim area. The people hated the Christians. The Muslims hated the Christians. They were walking 10, 11 miles to get water. And I can remember the story as they told us, and they sat us down with the pastor of the church. Well, what had happened a little while earlier is they'd been in a building program. And they were kind of hanging out. They were doing their thing, doing service that Sunday morning. What would happen is the extremists had come in the night before in their building process, undid the bolts to the building, to the roof. And when the wind came during the service, it blew the roof off the building, came down and landed on the pastor and killed the pastor. Pronounced dead there on the scene. He'd been dead for a little while. The church starts to pray. Incredible. The church starts to pray, praying their guts out, believing God for a miracle. All of a sudden, he comes back to life. In the hospital for a few months, they say, as he's getting ready to get out, the Muslims come, they beat up his wife. And they say, and almost to the point where he could barely recognize her. And now she's coming to the hospital. He's getting out, and he looks at her and says, man, God has called us to this place. We're not leaving. So he goes back. A few months later, we come in and we put a well in that area. And what happened is it radically transformed the community, radically transformed. Why? Because they saw a need. They didn't walk by. It didn't take, they didn't look at it and go, well, it's too difficult, we're going to leave. They said, even though this may seem like a neighbor, it's really like the story in the Bible we just read. It's a neighbor that, man, it kind of maybe even seems like an enemy, somebody you don't want to associate with, but they said, we've got to do this. And man, what has happened in that church, the church went on from there and it started to explode in growth. Things are happening. The church is now the center point of that little community. The Muslims are coming, why? Because we're meeting the need. And I love, as we look at the end of the story, I'm not going to take time to read it, but he took him, he picked him up, he bandaged him. He had to get a little bloody, a little dirty. He had to do some work, he had to do some effort. It took time out of his day to meet the need. He put him on his own donkey, or he stuck him in his own car, right? And drove him to where he could get help. Not only did he get him help there, but then he came back and said, listen, I'm going to pay whatever else is left over so that need can be met. Can you imagine that influence that he would have in that guy's life? Could you imagine the influence that he would have as he comes back and says, man, not only did I help you when you were hurting and broken and messed up, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to give even beyond that so that your need can be fully met. And so you won't have any bills after this thing's done. And I think back, man, so what some of our teenagers are doing, what even some students in my own family, man, I remember my son, last year, we just come back from Africa and we're sitting down and I'm sitting in my bed, climbing into bed, my son walks into my room. And to kind of take the story back, maybe a year earlier, where he had saved up all this money, and I didn't know this at the time, but God had spoke to him and said, take the money you're going to buy your vehicle with that you've saved, all this money for, take it and give it to missions. And my son, even in the midst of that, didn't want to obey, didn't want to listen to what God maybe was speaking to him. He wasn't ready to, and that's okay. He bought the truck. And so he's had the truck for just about 6 months. He bought it with all his own money. He comes back home and we're doing this missions push and God begins to speak to him again like, hey, would you sell your truck for me? Would you give up your truck so that people around the world could hear about Jesus? And my son walks into my bedroom one night and he starts to cry. And I'm like, what's up, buddy? He's now 16. And he goes, Dad, I think I'm supposed to sell my truck for Speed the Light. And at that point, that's more fun when it's someone else's story rather than your own family's. Because now I'm thinking, oh man, I've got to take him everywhere. I don't have money to buy him a new vehicle. You got all this stuff wrestling in your heart. As a pastor, I'm thinking, oh man. So I said, hey, just go to bed. Me and my wife, we sit up in bed. We're like, what are we gonna do now? We got to take him everywhere. So we'll have to explain to him in the morning. And so we get up and say, hey, buddy, just so you know, man, if we sell your truck, Mom and Dad are taking you or your buddies are taking you. We don't have money to give you another vehicle. He goes, yeah. He goes, Dad, God was telling me to give this thing up before I even bought it. And so now I've finally come to the spot where I'm willing to say, God, if you want to do this, I'm in. And so now a 16-year-old sitting in my house, and he's going, I want to be able to give and do something. Why? I want to be able to meet somebody's need. I want to not just be like the person that sees a need and doesn't meet it and walks by on the other side like a lot of religious people did in the story, but I want to be someone that sees a need and takes a moment. And it took sacrifice, it took hurt, it took some moments where I don't know how I'm going to do this. It took tears, it took effort to get to where he was to have the money. Now he's standing there and going, you know what? I'm in, Dad. And so we started calling around. Anybody know who wants to buy a vehicle? We get on the phone with somebody and say, I'll buy the vehicle on one condition. I said, what's that? He goes, if he keeps the truck. Because the moment you told me that he was supposed to sell the truck, God said, you let him keep the truck because I want to prove how faithful God is if he'll just step out and listen and be obedient to what God is asking him to do. Now, of course, that doesn't happen all the time. My daughter, so my son had a goal of $5,000. He sold the truck for $4,000, got to keep it. He had raised another $1,000. That got done, and he said, but Dad, the need isn't over. By the end of the year, the next month, he raised another $1,000 because he wanted to say, I want to come and finish the project. He didn't just pay it like the guy got him to the spot and pay it. He said, you know what, I'll come back later and I'll finish what's owed. That's what he did, just like in the story. My daughter, her goal was $5,000 last year. You know what she did? She got up every night or every day after school. She would go to hockey practice, she'd come home and she'd bake for 6 weeks straight. She'd bake from like 7 at night, 6 at night to 1 or 2 in the morning. And she'd do that every single night and sell the stuff that she made to give to missions. You know, she came to the end of her thing and she didn't make her $5,000 goal. She only made $4,000. And I didn't look at her and go, can't believe that. But you know what I did? As I said, that's amazing. If you'd have never dreamed of went after your goal, you did all that you could. And the cool part is my son came on the back end and between the two of them last year, raised $10,000 for missions. Now then you put on top of that what me and my wife did and what my youngest daughter did. And man, we probably gave last year about $18,000 to Speed the Light, to help people know. Why? Because we've seen over and over the need. We've seen over and over that there's a need out there that we can meet. And we don't want to just be like the religious people that walk on the other side. We want to be the people that when we see the need, it may take us time, it may take us effort, it may hurt a little bit, but we're going to say, we're going to make sure, because God has done so much in our lives, and we've fallen so in love with Jesus that we can't just hold on to it, that we've got to take what he said, now go tell everybody else about what's happened. And so, church, that's what we've done. I hope you have an amazing time, the rest of your small group here, but I do want to just leave you with one more challenge. What could you do? What could you do? The youth are trying to give $60,000. I'm just going to tell you that there's only been one time that I know of in the history of all of the world that there's been a youth ministry that's given $60,000 in one Wednesday night. One time. One time in the world, and your youth ministry is trying to do something that's been done only one other time that I know of. And so, man, get behind your students, get behind what they're doing. Let's see God do something incredible this week on Wednesday night. Let's blow this thing up and just go, man, we're behind you. But more important than being behind the students, God, we're behind the mission of you reaching, of seeing what you've done in our lives, and then saying, I'm going to see a need, and I'm going to go and do something with that need. And so thanks for being a part. Man, I hope you have just a great rest of your small group. What could you do now to help reach the need and meet people right where they're at so that more people can come to know Jesus around the world?